for most people who are not as philosophically oriented, like all of this God, no God, and the physics, is it supported or not? Like, what does it have to do with me in my life? And you just said it, which is, because if there is a creator, then there has to be a point to creation. And if everything just came into being spontaneously, randomness, we could try to come up with our own meaning in life. And hopefully we'll stumble on that. But it makes such a difference if one believes that we're here for a purpose, for a reason. What is that reason? And that's where, of course, the Torah comes in. So let's dive into that for a little between now and the end of our conversation. I really appreciate this, guys. I asked this question to some other physicists who also believe in Torah and Judaism. I spoke with Dr. Gerald Schroeder, famous MIT physicist who wrote Genesis and the Big Bang and a couple of other books. I spoke to Dr. Chaim Presby, very, very impressive physicist and rabbi, and Natan Slifkin, who is he's the animal doctor, but quite a scientist in his own right. And I asked him about Genesis 1, Genesis 2, the beginning of creation. Are these factual scientific descriptions of the universe? How do you guys approach the Torah's opening chapters that describe the creation of the world and of man, people?
So I think it's like very important to distinguish between ideas that are fundamental principles of the Torah, that God exists, that there's divine providence, there's such a thing as miracles, things like that. That without them, the Torah doesn't work. If there's no such thing as a miracle, the Torah just doesn't work. There's no divine providence, the Torah doesn't work. Versus an issue where how do you interpret the literal? How do you interpret the verses? Are they literal? Are they figurative, metaphorical? Are they speaking in a scientific framework? Are they speaking in a historical framework? Are they speaking in a values framework? So those are completely different issues. How do you interpret verses versus contrasted with does something contradict the underlying principle of the Torah? So what we do, our approach is based on Maimonides, and there's other of the earlier sages that, in terms of the first two chapters of Genesis, is we no longer have a tradition exactly what each thing means, and we have different interpretations by our sages that when they work, that's great, and when they seem to contradict modern science, then you say that it must be that we interpret them in a metaphorical way, in an allegorical way, something that's different. And you're not going to throw out the Torah because a verse has to be interpreted figuratively as opposed to literally. So those questions, they don't bother us, and they haven't bothered the great sages of Jewish sages. And in truth, it's much more, I think Christians are tied to that philosophy that everything has to be exactly literal. I know there are a lot of Jews who do hold that, but I don't think that's our tradition, that every verse has to be taken exactly literally. What would bother us is if something in modern science contradicted a principle in the Torah. Something modern science showed that it's impossible to have divine providence, that it was impossible to have free will. Miracles are impossible. God doesn't exist. Something like that. That would undermine the Torah. That would cause you to say, look, if modern science showed God didn't exist, you're not going to have the Torah or you'd have a contradiction in your mind. You'd be stuck. So those are real problems that we spend time trying to deal with. But the questions of how to interpret the verses, that to us is a secondary issue. You'd like to take it literally if you could. If it contradicts what your mind tells you is true, then you have to interpret it metaphorically.
Mm-hmm. So, for example, thank you, Aaron. So, for example, the world was created in 6 days. God rested on the seventh. And that seems to be negated by modern evolutionary theory. What's your take on that specifically?
Right. So there's various psukim in Tanakh, various verses in the scriptures, which basically use the word yom to not necessarily mean a day, a 24-hour period of time, but to be referring to a period, like the period of the Messiah, of Yemos HaMashiach. Or maybe if some other verse refers to the yom to refer to the unit of the 6 days of creation. So the verse, and there's various, there's a Ramban who mentions this, Nachmanides used to say this. The word Yom sometimes doesn't refer to a literal day. So whereas perhaps it was until science knew that the universe was 14 billion years or whatever, it was reasonable to believe that a yom literally means a day, a 24-hour period. But if science indicates that that's not the case, and it indicates that the universe was actually much, much longer, so then we have a long tradition of interpreting words of the Torah in various ways, and the word day itself is refers to a period of time in various instances. So 6 days doesn't necessarily have to mean 6 24-hour periods, but it could be 6 periods of time. And the verses are indicating that God didn't create the universe in one fell swoop, that it was just there, but there was an unfolding of the universe in various stages, and there were 6 stages of the universe until it came to its final culmination, which is Shabbos. So there's it's an interesting statement of the Rashba, Shlomo ben Aderas, who basically from the 1200s, he says something to the effect, I don't have the quote exactly, but that it's the way of the pious people of our tradition that when they come across a verse which is proven, which the plain interpretation of it is contradicted by proven knowledge, by proven science, then we interpret it metaphorically. So there's a long chain of a history of interpreting verses. As we know, it says the hand of God in the Torah, but God doesn't have a hand; He's not physical. So there's a long history of interpreting verses metaphorically when we know that can't be the case. Of course, I would think the assumption is the verses are that they're literal, but if science shows that that's not the case, then we have to reinterpret it.
Also,
again,
I had
the
heard
plain interpretation of
that's
the
very
verses as
helpful
being a
and
metaphor.
also clear. I didn't realize that was the Rashba, the way of pious people to interpret a verse metaphorically when it goes up against proven science. Is that the reason also why the sun is not created in the Torah in Genesis, doesn't come into existence until the fourth day, I think, right? And the way we define a day isn't it? You tell me, I'm not a scientist. I thought the way we define a day is the rotation of the world on its axis. And isn't that somehow related to the sun? If there's no sun, then can you even consider, you don't even have to go. In other words, Ellie, you're saying because the term yom is used to denote not simply a 24-hour day, but can we say, based on the fact that the sun doesn't come into existence according to the Torah till day 4, that you can't have a 24-hour day until the sun comes into existence? No?
You could argue that. I mean, I think the Ramban at the time, again, based on his science, thought that they were 24-hour periods. It's not going to be based upon the sun, but you could take the amount of time which it takes for the sun for the day, or our day, and say somehow project that backwards. So it's true that the day isn't going to mean literally like what we interpret to be a day. Like can't be Vayer Vevoker, it was day, it was evening, and it was day. Can't refer to sunrise and sunset, given that the sun wasn't in place. But there would be ways to interpret it as being 24-hour periods, even though the sun isn't in place. And I think there's a Ramban who suggests that it was literal. But again, there's no reason why the Ramban would suggest otherwise. We're not saying that there's a tradition that it's not literal. We're just saying that given that modern science indicates that the universe was not that way, then that indicates we have to interpret it as a metaphor. Because Ramban also, there's an analogous Ramban. He says, this is also Nachmanides, who says that the plain interpretation of the verse of the Torah would lead us to believe that the rainbow was created right after the flood. He says, but he says it's not true. We know that the Greeks tell us that a rainbow stems from the natural properties of water and light, and therefore we have to reinterpret the verse of the Torah that when the Torah says, "I placed my rainbow in the cloud," it doesn't mean he placed it there at that moment, but it means the rainbow which he created previously was now being utilized to be a sign about of the covenant between.
Now, this is
so Ramban also is
right. So this is a very important conversation
based
because
upon
unfortunately,
the science,
I've seen this a lot in my own teaching, that there are not enough Jewish people. Most Jews in America, let's say, have not had the benefit of yeshiva education. Have not really studied the Torah, the Bible, Hebrew Scripture critically. And most Jews, I think, understanding of Torah comes from a little more of a Christian concept because that's the civilization we live in. It's the culture. And many Christians read the Bible literally, as you said before. So this whole conversation I'm having with you guys right now is worth it just for this very point. For anyone who's listening to this, it doesn't mean that we don't have a methodology. We just interpret verses in the Torah willy-nilly. But there is no such idea in Torah that we have to read every verse literally. Okay, when I sometimes say an eye for an eye, ayin tachat ayin, and we obviously don't read that literally. So most people think, that's because we're moderns. But if you would really be a biblical Jew, a Jew who takes the Torah seriously, you would pluck out, God forbid, somebody's eye if their eye was taken out. And that's not the reason we don't read that verse literally. We don't read that verse literally because we have the oral tradition that teaches us how to read a verse. Where's the comma? Where's the period? There are no punctuation points in the Torah. So the whole thing is left up to our Masorah, which is our classic understanding of how to read the biblical text. So that's a very, very important idea. Gerald Schroeder, anyone listening to this also should pick up his book on this because he makes that point in the very beginning of the book. That's not the way classically Jews read the Torah. Literally, if you did, you'd have a lot of problems with science.